Welcome to 3 Count Commentaries. Today we're going to talk about Broken Skull Sessions featuring Jeff Hardy. And I was really waiting on this and was surprised there wasn't a lot of people talking about it. Then I kind of watched it and realized there wasn't a lot to say. Jeff is very reserved, somewhat quiet, despite the fact that he's very loud. But I think the one thing that we walked away from here is that Jeff Hardy is at his heart a very creative guy. And to delve a little bit into the archetypes, Jeff Hardy is what we would call a lover. He's a guy who is very emotionally attached to what he's doing. And for him, no limits is the best concept. If you really want to know what I'm talking about, in the archetype series, there's a video called The Artist. And when I go through the artist, I talk about the lover being one of the foundations of what I refer to as the artist. And when you look at that perspective, it's almost like I'm talking like astrology here, like when you talk about male psychology, which is what I do in the archetype videos. It's usually male psychology, but it appeals to women sometimes too. Is that it almost comes across like the zodiac. Like when you talk to people and they're like, oh yeah, I'm a Scorpio, yada, yada, yada. And people are like, that's not real. But it lines up perfectly with what they believe, how some people behave, like Scorpios are supposedly, passionate, obsessed with sex, that sort of thing. And then you meet some girl who is a Scorpio and you're like, wow, she's everything I thought a Scorpio would be. That's kind of how I feel sometimes when I come across these archetype videos and I say something and then people are like, later on, are like, man, you did say that Roman Reigns is a king archetype. And then they do a storyline. I've been talking about this for a year. And then they do a storyline where Roman Reigns literally calls himself a king and wears a crown, So it was very interesting. So I felt the exact same way when I started sitting here. And I remember doing The Artist. And I believe I didn't use Jeff Hardy, but he was a good example of what an artist would be. And that's really what he's talking about here, is how much he loves the creativity aspect of pro wrestling and creativity in the world. Because this is a guy who does music, he does art, he's building all these contraptions in his backyards for his kids. It's very fun stuff to sit back and listen to. And you see that Jeff Hardy's every bit the artist. On the flip side, and this is what really kills me, is the negative pole of what we refer to as the artist. Each one has two negative poles, but one of them is the impotent lover. The other is the addict. And when you look at people who I would consider to be very strong artistic wrestlers, Eddie Guerrero, Shawn Michaels, Jeff Hardy, what do they all have in common? They're all drug addicts, right? So when you think about it, they all become addicted to wrestling because of the adrenaline, the passion for the audience, the passion for the art form, how much they love engaging with the audience. And that's basically what Jeff Hardy was talking about here, was that he wasn't the brains of the Hardy outfit. He didn't sit back and put together the psychology of the whole thing. He just added his spots into what other guys were doing. And then when you think about it, you think like, man, I could just see Jeff sitting in the corner doodling, and Matt is on the other side of the arena with Christian and the Dudleys and Edge, and they're trying to put this whole thing together, how this could make sense. And Jeff's like, I want to jump off that. I don't care what else we do, I just want to jump off that. And now they have to try to find some way to get Jeff's crazy idea into this match. And it just seems like such a Jeff Hardy thing that he doesn't overcomplicate things. He just does what feels good. He just does what is in the moment. He wants to top himself. He talks about that a lot here, is that, he lives mostly now to see what he can do. And I think it best is encapsulated in his comment when he said that when he was young, taking all these crazy bumps and doing all this crazy stuff, he was experimenting with the limits of his body. What can he do? And he wanted to know what he could do. And the only way for him to know what he could do was for him to actually do it. And so he kind of became what he, through sheer trial and error and sheer willpower, just wanting to know, he became Jeff Hardy. So his story, they began in 1994, where Jeff is a job guy. He's 16 years old, which is incredible. Of course, he works his first match for Razor Ramon, and he talks about how he hated that. He wasn't a fan of it. But he also talked a lot about, again, the creativity. He talked about how it motivates him, and that he still feels like it's a very powerful creative mode, and that's why he's still doing it. Because Steve Austin said, like, you took some hellacious bumps. You're 44 years old. How are you still doing this? And Jeff's like, I just keep finding new ways to be creative. Just keep finding new ways to make myself interested in what I do. And he started talking about painting his face and painting his nails and the rainbow hair and all these different things that he put together. He said he just did them. Nobody told him to do it. He just did it because he felt like doing it. And it would catch on. And I was just kind of like, wow. It's just amazing that he just has that ability, that knack. Especially at the time when nobody else was doing it or wasn't that big of a deal. For him to be sort of the trendsetter in that way. So he talked about being a fan of Sting when he was younger, when he was a Sting and the Ultimate Warrior. And when they used to do their home wrestling thing, he used to paint his face. So now he talks about painting his face today, and that even sometimes when he doesn't feel like doing it, he does it anyway, because he remembers going to see Sting at a WCW house show in North Carolina. And he said he touched Sting's shoulder. And he said he always wanted to make kids feel the way he felt when Sting came past him and he touched Sting on the shoulder. And he wants to make kids feel that same way. And he said he thinks about that when he's tired and he's beat up and he doesn't feel like painting his face. He says nothing would make him sadder than looking into the crowd and some kid has his face painted and Jeff just didn't feel like doing it. I think this is what another thing that really encapsulates the Jeff Hardy thing is he says that he's not a match guy. He's a moment guy. He's always wanted to make moments. And before he talked about this, he talked about WrestleMania 2000 and jumping off that ladder at WrestleMania 2000 in the aisleway on Bubba Ray Dudley. And he talked about how this was his first spiritual experience with pro wrestling and that the adrenaline was so high it became almost addictive, and he wanted to keep raising the bar. And he says that he was scared. And he says all these great things that he's been able to do, he's been scared to do them. And that's why he did it, because he's addicted to his own fear. And that's a very insane concept. It's like some people are kind of that way. When you go, I've never been a roller coaster guy. I've never been a fan of roller coasters. But some people, they like being scared, and Jeff is like, again, pushing the limits of his own body, saying to himself, this ladder was so tall, it was frightening to do it. But now you've done it. It's exhilarating for you to do. You're like, can I do it again? Can I jump higher than this? And that, of course, keeps leading Jeff to doing more and more and more spectacular, outrageous things. But in doing that, you got all the downside that come with it. Like when he broke his leg doing motocross. He talked about that on here. All of the injuries and all of the, him tearing up his tailbone, his knees and everything. And he's like, I'm 44. I can't really do that stuff anymore. But there's new ways for me to be afraid and to do new things, new interesting things. He talked about the most recent ladder match with Sami Zayn handcuffing his gauge to his ear. And he said like that was frightening to him because one false move, he could have ripped his ear open and ended up in the hospital. So he really wanted to do it because it was something that scared him, but it didn't require for him to jump off of anything at 44 years old. So I was like, this is amazing stuff. Of course, he talked a lot about TLC and the working relationship with Jeff Hardy. I mean, not Jeff, but Matt, and how Matt was his manager, and Matt was the guy who did everything for them, and Michael Hayes is integral into his career. That was all very good stuff, all very interesting stuff. But I was very interested in Jeff. I was far more interested in Jeff, and Jeff has always been sort of upfront, And he talked about all his releases and how he refused rehab the first time. When he got released in 2003, he felt like he wasted WWE's time because this was after, of course, he did the wonderful match with Undertaker. And he's talking about how he was in Undertaker's debt because he didn't have to do that. Didn't have to sell for him. Didn't have to, put him over the way that he did. And because Undertaker was working heel, didn't have to show him any type of respect after the match either. And that 2003 release, he said he felt like he wasted the company's time. He felt like he was never coming back. And that he had spoiled the Undertaker's gesture. And in 2004, he got fired from TNA. He said, like, they didn't even offer me rehab. They just fired me. So then he said he quit cold turkey or whatever it was. He never really got too specific. He didn't even use my demons. He just said whatever it was, he quit cold turkey. After he got clean, he decided to go to some house shows, some SmackDown house shows or some TNA house shows, just to tell everybody that he was clean and to show his face, and so everybody could see him and know that he was doing okay. And he got 2 contracts, a WWE contract and a TNA contract. And of course, he took the WWE contract. This led to his 2006 return. So Steve Austin asked him, when did the drugs and all this kind of stuff start? And Jeff tells this incredible story. And I 100% believe him. He said it didn't start till he was 21 years old, which means he had been in the business for 5 years by the time he even started doing drugs and alcohol. And he said him and Matt were 2 straight kids. They didn't party, they didn't drink, they didn't do any drugs, they didn't do anything. And he said he doesn't blame the business for what happened to him, but the grind of the business is what pushed him into doing drugs and alcohol, because he was going out there tearing up his body all the time, and he's constantly on the road, and you got these aches and pains, just the little aches and pains. And that's when it started. It started when he was 21. That means 1999. Shortly before so that means he got out of control really fast, because Jeff started acting weird in like 2000. By 2002, 2003, they had been dealing with Jeff for a while at that point. But you're talking about, this guy who is 22, 23 years old. Phenomenal, future ahead of him. Homegrown guy. WWE loves homegrown guys. Even the guys that are the size of Jeff Hardy. And he botched it. So he came back in 2006, and he was kind of on a good upswing. Things were going good. He's talking about John Laurinaitis was giving him a ton of credit, not knowing that he had already failed a drug test. And what John Laurinaitis was talking about how he was doing so good, and how it made Jeff feel better about himself, but he had just gotten drug tested, and now he was going to get failed 2 of them. And he says that he started reading papers, when he was dealing with his own drug issues. And he says he read papers about how, creative people have problems with drugs and alcohol. And I've seen that a lot. And if you ever have paid attention to the music scene and the art world, you will see a lot of it. I remember reading papers about the amount of heroin that jazz musicians used to do. Like when my mom was growing up and stuff like that, there were a lot of people who didn't want folks hanging out at the jazz clubs. My mom's a little bit too young for the jazz clubs. It was more like rock and roll, the Temptations and all that kind of stuff when she was growing up. But they still had that stigma that you don't go to the jazz clubs, because the jazz clubs are where all the heroin addicts were. And you probably already know the rock and roll, that got all the cocaine, the Rick James era. My mom was an adult when Rick James was popping. But Parliament Funkadelic in the 70s and all that kind of stuff, those guys were doing all kinds of shit. And of course, in the 80s and the 90s, you start hearing rappers talk about doing drugs. Some rappers were doing harder drugs, DMX and Scarface. DMX was on crack. Scarface, I think he said he wrote his entire album, The Untouchable, while high on cocaine. So you started seeing like all these creative people doing drugs. And you also see it with authors. A lot of authors write books while they're high. That's why the books come out very weird, because they get high and do this stuff. And it's not a surprise, and most people know this, and it's it's a tool of the trade. I read interviews in various rap magazines about guys who say, "Oh yeah, I got to get high before I write because it opens your mind up to, opens your imagination and all this kind of stuff." But you have to wonder, wrestlers are the same way. You know, some of the best wrestlers in the world were addicts, drug addicts. Because they opened their minds to all forms of creativity. Pushing the boundaries, doing all sorts of things. And maybe that's part of the issue today is there's not enough drug addicts in wrestling. I mean, I don't know what more to say. I'm not saying that guys should start walking around doing cocaine and heroin, but I'm saying that the business was a lot better when guys were on cocaine. Look at the Road Warriors and the Ultimate Warrior and Hulk Hogan, and Randy Savage. These guys were not just roid freaks, they were crazy people. But they said crazy stuff. Roddy Piper. They said wild stuff. They did crazy stuff. Shawn Michaels. I mean, whenever drugs start getting involved, guys' game just go up for somehow. It's like the fucks go down, the entertainment value goes up, and the more shit they do, the more entertaining they tend to be. Because and it seemed like the cleaner wrestling got, as far as when the boys got clean, the business got kind of bland. Everybody's sort of even keeled. Anybody who gets, too much of an ego is an asshole, or something like that. But back then, everybody was an asshole. So it's a very interesting thing to see and experience. But to go back to Jeff Hardy, he talked about, he went to rehab in 2006. It was his first trip to rehab. And he said that it was like zombies would walk in, but then 5 days later, they would turn into normal people. And he was sort of, weirded out by that. And really, and I thought that was very fun too. So, Jeff talked about the ladders. And he said that him and his brother used to buy breakaway ladders where they tested all of their ladder match stuff. He talked about they used to do it in Omega. They would get breakaway ladders. He talked about working construction at 16. And he would save up his money to get these breakaway ladders because they were so inspired by the Shawn and Razor ladder match. They just wanted to do ladder matches. So they would get these, I guess, wooden ladders and break them and, go out and buy more, with their construction worker money. And he said a lot of the spots that they did, specifically in the match with Edge and Christian, were things that they had been doing when they were doing backyard stuff. Plywood and breakaway ladders. They wrestled at the county fairs and all this kind of stuff. So they had some type of, I guess you could say, experience. It's some version of experience with this whole ordeal. And it's very interesting that these guys knew what they wanted to do in their life. And even when they were too young to be doing it, they were practicing it. And of course, like most silly kids, doing it in their backyard and all that kind of stuff. But then they got to do it in real life. And they got to, make those moments that they had been dreaming of in the county fair. And it was very interesting to me to hear that. And, of course, Jeff talked about winning the world title, which, he says that when he saw Sting at 12 years old, he was inspired. And he always wanted to bring that to other people. And he said that literally Armageddon 2008 was uncontrolled emotion. And he says that it's special when all the people believe in you. And he said he knew it was meant to be. He knew he was destined to become the world champion. But he just didn't know how and didn't know when. But he knew it was going to happen. But then he said a weird thing that I felt was kind of brought it back to earth. He said now, after he did it, he felt like, now what? Like, worked my whole career for this. Now what? And I was like, ooh. For a guy like Jeff Hardy, who has just been spending like an hour telling you he's addicted to his own fear, he likes to test the limits, he wants to see how far he can go. Now he's reached the pinnacle of the industry he dedicated his life to. What questions could he possibly have been asking himself at that point? You know, like, not really. Now what? You know, it's like happily ever after. Like I always say, with baby faces, you have to do what's after that. What's after the happily ever after? And Jeff was thinking about literally that after he won the title. Like he was super happy. He was very excited. And then when the adrenaline came down, he was like, okay, I got this thing. Now what? You know, how much further can I go? And he said, like, you know, he felt like it was a huge accomplishment for him, but, you know, he knew he wasn't never going to be the face of the company or anything like that. So I thought that was very interesting. To me, that was very telling about sort of how Jeff Hardy thinks about things and how what he wants from the business is an unending amount of mountains to climb. And so I definitely can see Jeff going to AEW. If for no other reason than because it's something different that he's never done before. And just doing that would be something he could really sink his teeth into. And it wouldn't be because he hates WWE or anything like that, but because it's a new mountain to climb. And I can see that being a big deal. I see, you know, and it makes sense to me when you think about it. Like, once he's done everything that he can do, you know, he can't sit still and continue. Like, there's been a lot of crazy Jeff Hardy stuff coming out lately about him wanting to do Willow in WWE, him wanting to do a new personality. And then also his concept of the spinning ring match that he came up with. What did he call it? I forget what he called it, but he was a WCW fan as a kid. Of course he would, because he was born in the Jim Crockett Promotions territory. So of course he was a WCW fan. And he talked about how they had the spinning ring in Orlando. And he had this concept of having a match where the ring spins. And I think like in 2-minute intervals, it would spin around faster and faster. And then it would slow down and stop. And then it would spin again. And I was like, oh my goodness. Talk about giving guys vertigo. I don't know about that one, Jeff. But you see that he's having these kooky ideas. These crazy ideas. And he is usually the guy that's on for the ride. And he talked about with the Broken Universe, because they did talk about that. And I thought that was very good that they brought it up. And Jeff was honest. It was all Matt. You know, Matt came up with everything. He just went along for the ride. He just did what he usually does. And that is he let Matt, you know, architect the whole thing. And he just came in and put his own little flourish on it. And he said that was the beginning of him trying to move away from being a spot monkey. Because, you know, Matt wanted this run to last. And of course, this is around the time Matt started to limp pretty prominently. Because he was leaning very heavily on the character. You know, you can watch those days of TNA and know that Matt Hardy wasn't the in-ring wrestler he had used to be. He wasn't. He was pretty much done by that point. So he was pulling a Scott Steiner. He was going 100% character all the time. And he was kind of doing the same thing to Jeff, where he was kind of trying to change Jeff. So Brother Nero wasn't Jeff Hardy. So he would say to Jeff, you know, this is going to cure you of your addiction to ladders and all this kind of stuff. So you couldn't jump off ladders and you couldn't do high risk stuff. I don't remember 100% whether that was true or not, but I think that was the general idea, is that they wanted to change Jeff's style. And then he said that he felt like Matt put together the Expedition of Gold, which I forgot about. I forgot about the Expedition of Gold, where the Hardy Boys went to 3 different promotions and won the tag team titles. He won the Impact Tag Team titles, the Ring of Honor Tag Team Championships, and the WWE Tag Team Championships, all within 1 year. And he said he felt like Matt put all that together because it came just a little too perfectly. But it's almost like he was a passenger in his own life at certain points, where he kind of just, you know, put his career in the hands of, you know, Matt or whoever else was around and just kind of went with it. And whenever he's kind of left alone, things would kind of go off the rails. So, of course, he talks about WrestleMania 25 when he wrestled Matt Hardy. He said they were inspired by Owen and Bret Hart. But he said that match was cut a lot. A lot of the match was cut out. And that was the first time he had really gone to Vince and yelled and screamed and acted a fool at Vince. It's because Vince cut so much time out of that match, so they had to cut out so many spots. He felt like the match should have been so much better than it was. But he felt he was, one of his favorite matches was when he got to wrestle with Matt at WrestleMania. And I need to relive that match because I don't think I've seen it that many times. I don't think I've ever really been a fan of Matt and Jeff wrestling each other. I don't remember myself being super excited for that. And I don't remember, too many other people being super excited for it either. So maybe I'll just randomly rewatch Matt Hardy wrestle Jeff Hardy at WrestleMania. 2009, he leaves WWE again. He left on top. He failed in 2 more drug tests. He talked about how he was working, filling in for Undertaker. So he felt like he was, again, letting Undertaker down because Undertaker, I think, was injured at the time. And he was filling in for him when he got busted. Because he said he knew he was leaving anyway. So around this time, of course, he got busted ordering pills online. And he started talking about, this is what scared him straight. At least he believed it was going to scare him straight because he was legitimately scared because the feds bust into his house and, had him and his wife face down on the carpet and everything. And then they had their first baby in 2010. They had a second baby in 2015. But of course, it wasn't what scared Jeff straight because TNA Victory Road 2011, when he embarrassed himself in the ring with Sting. Jeff Hardy is, and he was really somber in this moment. He was talking about, hey, this is my hero, Sting. The guy's my hero, and I do that. I went and got so screwed up. He talked about it was Somas. I think I talked about Somas on this channel recently, in terms of the John Moxley stuff. And he says he remembered talking to Sting about how badass the match was going to be, and they had all these spots planned, and then he went and just did Somas, and he did too many, and he couldn't function. And he says he embarrassed himself in front of his hero. And this one he said that, you can't blame his addiction on the business. That is but he says that, the drugs were easier to get off of than the alcohol because the alcohol was more plentiful. It was everywhere. But the pills was hard. It was easier to shake. He was also asked about the difference between TNA and WWE, where he said it wasn't really that much of a difference to him. It was just that WWE felt like it was a bigger deal than TNA. So this was a very good episode of Broken Skull Sessions, man. I really got a lot out of this. Even though it seems like Jeff is just kind of too laid back. And he's not like, they didn't sit back and tell all these wild stories about getting hammered. Because that's kind of a difficult subject for Jeff with his history of drugs and alcohol and stuff like that. So, it's very difficult for him to talk about the good old days of being drunk or high and hanging out with so-and-so, or they didn't tell any cool stories about the matches or anything. They just talked about the moments because Jeff doesn't really care about matches. He cares about the moments. But it was still a awesome view into the mind of Jeff Hardy and how he looks at both pro wrestling and his own career. Jeff Hardy is one of my favorite wrestlers ever. He's tremendous. First ballot Hall of Famer, no doubt. As a solo act, one of the greatest baby faces in the history of the business. Very creative guy. Hopefully he'll get an opportunity to do something a little bit different. I know that he's been talking about wanting to do Willow. He's also wanted to talk about turning heel, which they would never let him do. Vince McMahon would never let anybody turn Jeff Hardy heel. And he's also talked about the spinning ring match. So now Jeff is 44 years old. And he's like, I got to pitch ideas now. And he said he's never been the pitch guy. Matt's always been the pitch guy. So now he's got to pitch his own ideas. And maybe that's the why his creative has always been so, sagging so much. Because I know it was his idea to do the bar fight. He talked about it. And he also talked about it here. about, you know, it was fun for him to be able to do the bar fight, and because it was a cinematic match and stuff like that. But we'll see if we see any of these crazy ideas that Jeff wants to do. I'm almost certain we're not going to see that spinning ring thing. We might see Willow. We might, depending on how the concept comes together to Vince. The spinning ring match, probably not. The heel turn, I don't see how Vince will even allow that to happen. But it will all be very interesting to see. And I hope he gets a chance to do some of this stuff, man. He's at the point in his career where you can't damage him. You know, you can't hurt Jeff Hardy. So why not let him do Willow? Why not let him, you know, try to turn heel if he wants to? I mean, if it doesn't work, then he ends up like Shawn Michaels, where he turns heel for one program and then he's ends up as a babyface again later on. Even though I don't think it could possibly happen for Jeff. I don't think people would boo Jeff Hardy. I just don't see it. You know, if anything, it'll probably make him more over, because that's just kind of the kind of luck he's had. You know, and plus I didn't like his heel turn in TNA. He was whack. But let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Did you watch this? What did you think of it? Like this video, share this video, subscribe to the channel, donate to the channel. Thank you for your time, and I will talk to you guys later.